Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Leading Lights interview in conjunction with CMI's 75th anniversary. I'm Ann Francke, the Chief Executive of CMI, and today I'm delighted to be speaking with David Grayson CBE. David is the former chair of Carers UK, and he's an independent commentator, advisor, and speaker on responsible business and corporate sustainability. He's the author of 9 books, the most recent of which is the Sustainable Business Handbook, and also Emeritus Professor of Corporate Responsibility of Cranfield University School of Management. So welcome, David, and I know you're also on our 75th Anniversary Council as well. So delighted to have you with us today.
I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Well, let's get started. Obviously, one question of key importance in your line of work is values and ethics. Do you think that values and ethics and culture should be at the heart of professional management and indeed sustainable business practice? And if so, why and how can we manifest that in our everyday practices?
So, Anne, apart from the other bits of the bio you read out, I'm also the chair of the Institute of Business Ethics. So I think I better say yes to the first question. Joking aside, I think that ethics and values and having a really strong, engaging, empowering, inspiring culture is absolutely fundamental. And I suppose one of the things I was reflecting before this conversation that I've come to the realization over the years is that culture is an absolutely critical part of any organization, whether it's a public sector one or a charity, third sector social enterprise, or a business. And having a really good, positive culture, I think, is absolutely fundamental to success. So, yes, I think this has to be part of all of our lives. And the reality is that all organizations have a culture. The question is whether it's a culture that people have consciously willed and want to have that culture, and it's the culture which the board and the senior management team have identified as what would be a powerful, positive culture, or whether it's what has happened because people haven't paid attention.
Right. It's a really good point. Well, how do you then intentionally create a positive culture in everyday practice?
So I think for any organization, again, I repeat, whether this is public, third sector, or business, you need to have the active conversations about, so what now is the way we do business around here? I.e., what is the current culture? What do people think are positive aspects of that culture? What do people like? What makes them motivated and want to work for us, whether it's the CMI or Cranfield or Institute of Business Ethics or wherever? And are there certain aspects of the way we do business at the moment, the way we operate, that in reality people don't think is healthy, don't think is advancing the cause, and which people want to actively try and address? So I'm really interested in the way, I think quite correctly, that groups in this country like Financial Reporting Council, similar bodies in the Netherlands, in Japan, etc., are now saying it's part of the job of a board to ultimately define what is the desired culture, and then periodically to be checking and seeing, is the actual culture of this organization the reality versus is our actual culture aligned with our desired culture, or is there a big gap that we need to work to try and close?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really important point, and we'll come back to talk a little bit more about that. But I'm also keen to, you've had a very full and varied career in leadership at a number of organizations. What challenges have you had that you think still exist now for people, and what advice would you give them to help overcome those challenges?
So I still think one of the continuing challenges is, in any organization of any size, It's probably much easier in a smaller organization than it is in a vast international one. But for any organization, how do leaders at different levels of the organization inspire and motivate and help people to want to give of their best and to be able to give of their best? And I think for me, one of the most critical aspects of a really positive culture, back to the previous conversation, is around, is that culture one which is inspiring and is engaging, and where people do feel that they can speak out and speak up? So if they think that there's something not quite right, are they able, and do they feel that they will be listened to if they do challenge some behaviors that they don't think is really quite right? And conversely, do people feel it's worth it to make suggestions, ideas for improvements, maybe champion as a social intrapreneur, which is something I've been working on with colleagues for many years, this phenomenon of people inside large businesses who are being highly entrepreneurial, not just for the business, but also for society. Are these social entrepreneurs people who are feeling in their organizations it's worthwhile to stick their neck out and so on? So for me, it is an enduring challenge around the quality of getting the best out of people.
Okay, great. Well, can you maybe share with us as an example from your past where you've done one of those things, either called out something where you felt that wasn't the right thing to be doing, or spoken up about something that you thought an organization should be doing, and had that adopted?
So I suppose one of the things that I've been involved with over many years is the whole idea of responsible business. So a business taking responsibility for its social and its environmental and its economic impacts, and making that an integral part of the way that the organization is run. And so I spent most of my adult life actually in one form or another really trying to promote those ideas. And one of the exciting things is that over 40 plus years now, ideas that back at the beginning of the 1980s were regarded as really rather radical and strange and so on, are now part of everyday language. And we have mainstream investors talking now about the importance of good ESG, social governance aspects of business, having good ESG performance and so on. So I suppose trying to champion the idea that business can be, when it's run well, a positive force for good in society, and that actually that's much better business all round for the business as well as for society when it does that.
Great, and it's only taken 40 years.
We're still working on it. We're still
working on it. There's still some way to go, and we'll no doubt come on to that. But what about some of the new challenges maybe that have emerged, since you've embarked on your career, that for people that are just starting out in their careers now? What do you see as some of those?
So undoubtedly, one of the challenges we've all lived through the last 2 years with the pandemic, many of us have been working remotely, have been involved in lots and lots of Zooms and Teams and lots of other platforms that I'd never heard of hardly before COVID-19 struck. And whilst I think we've shown that you can still run great organizations successfully, I don't think we have yet really begun to think through the consequences in terms of the inevitable depletion of social capital that we've all been relying on for the last 2 years. And so in so many cases, we've been relying on relationships that have already been built up before the pandemic. And I think one of the challenges now, as we come out, hopefully, of the worst of the pandemic, and as organizations start to think about new ways of working, more hybrid ways of working and so on, how do you retain all of the undoubted advantages of being able to work remotely, to be a digital nomad if you have that kind of opportunity? How do we retain all of that flexibility and those positive benefits? But also, how do we now start to refill, if you like, the social capital that has inevitably been spent down during the last 2 years. And so
Mhm.
I think that's a very immediate challenge. And if, as so many people are saying, we will now have much more varied patterns of working for many of us. Obviously, if you are on the front line as a hospital worker, or you are a care worker, etc., or you are looking after keeping the shelves stocked in Tesco's or Sainsbury's, etc., then you don't have that freedom, you don't have that flexibility. But for many of us who are more knowledge-based workers, I do think we have to think about some of the managerial challenges of how you could build the capacity of new recruits, how you induct them into the kind of desired positive culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know from our research at CMI that managing remote teams and indeed inducting new people is something that managers are finding difficult. It is more difficult, obviously, in this hybrid world. Do you have a specific piece of advice you would give to the people trying to work with this challenge?
So I do think one of the things we've tried to do on one of the boards that I'm a member of is just to do a bit of a check-in in the first few minutes. It's the equivalent, if you like, of when everyone is assembling in the physical meeting room and pouring their cup of coffee or their cup of tea, etc., and getting their papers out and so on. You have the small talk, but it's very important just in terms of checking in to see where people are individually at and what's going on in their lives and so on, because obviously some people have had some pretty challenging times, and I'm acutely conscious of just being aware of people's mental health and well-being. And I do
Mhm.
think, again, and I'm so keen for groups like CMI to be really championing this idea about how do we make sure that we have a really positive, healthy workplace, not just in the physical sense of is there good air quality and so on, which obviously becomes even more important after we've had the COVID scare, but also even more importantly in terms of the sense of the mental health and well-being in the workplaces. So I think for me that would be one thing that I'm taking out of the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of this is something to be much more aware of, not just for
Mhm.
myself, but in terms of my work colleagues, my board colleagues, and so on.
Sure. So that's a really important tip, looking after your colleagues' mental well-being and asking after it, right? Before just launching into the business of the day. That's a really good and a very important point. And again, it chimes with what we know people regard as super important through our research at CMI. But as you said, both individuals and organizations have been through a huge amount of change in the past couple of years. Um, how do we now, as we move forward, find the right balance between continuity and change in your view?
Gosh, and the reality is that the speed of change is only going to accelerate in so many different areas, isn't it?
Mhm.
Well, that's in terms of all of the huge advances in terms of AI and machine learning and big data and so on. Whether it's the speed of reaction that we need to have to global challenges like the climate emergency, more extreme weather conditions inevitable, as well as all the challenges of hyperglobal inequalities. So I think anyone who was saying, gosh, we've got through COVID-19, now we can relax, now we can slow down and it's going to be a different pace again. No, we are, I think, in a time of absolutely accelerating change in lots of different areas. And so we need, again, teams of people. And I'm a great believer in the importance of the team rather than just the heroic individuals. Obviously, the heroic individuals sometimes have their place, as we're seeing right now in the Ukraine. But
Mhm.
generally, I think it goes back to one of my favorite management books of all time, Built to Last, the Collins and Porras classic from the 1990s, and some of the key ideas they had in there about what makes the organizations which have a better chance of continuing into the indefinite future. So the really strong, cohesive team, having the absolute clarity of the inspiring purpose, having the BHAGs, the big hairy audacious goals. I realize I show my age when I talk to students and I talk about the BHAGs, and they all look at me as though, what is the idiot talking about now? So you have to go back and explain, oh gosh, this is one of the great classic management books when I was growing up and being a sort of starting early, relatively early in my career. So I think some of those points around the Collins and Porras Built to Last, around also, developing your leadership and not relying on going out and buying in talent from elsewhere, but how do you home grow a team so that you have people who've got the sense of cohesion and commitment. Yes, you need to constantly be finding ways of challenging that team so you don't get into the horrible dangers of groupthink. But I do think that there is a kind of a, well, it's back to all the other Collins and Porras points about moving from the tyranny of the or to the genius of the and. And in this particular context, I think developing and really making the most of home talent and leavening it with some constantly new experience to build the diversity of ideas and experiences, from which then hopefully you build an inclusive culture.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually on that point of inclusivity, I know you were the chair of Carers UK for many years, and do a lot in the area of disability. Now that's a very important point in management and leadership. And I know a lot of people wonder about how can we make things more inclusive for those with a disability. How do we best capture the data? Because after all, not all disabilities are visible. And how do we get over the fact that many managers are still very uncomfortable in discussing this, or even broaching the topic? So maybe you can talk a little bit about that and share some of your knowledge with us.
So I am very heavily involved because I'm also now chairing then in Cheshire, the big international pan-disability charity. So for me, first of all, those of us who are disabled just have to be open about our own disabilities. In my case, I very nearly died when I was 11. I, for some reason that is still not known to the medics, contracted a horrible bone disease, and it was touch and go apparently for about a month whether I would live or die, and thank goodness for penicillin. And then when I was sufficiently able to withstand quite a serious operation, my hip bone was removed and everything, so I don't have a hip bone on the left hand side, so I walk with a pronounced limp. So in the great scheme of things, it's various things that I would have loved to have done in life I haven't been able to, but in the great scheme of things, it's not been much of a barrier for me to do things. I do think it's important that those of us who are now in positions, hopefully at least in some small ways, to be able to influence and make a difference, should first of all be open about our disability, to encourage other people to feel comfortable to do so. It's very interesting. There was a piece of research done, I think last year or the year before now, about the FTSE 100 largest companies and their boards, and that there was not a single board member who was publicly declared as being disabled. Now, statistically, we know, given the average age of members of FTSE boards and given the correlation between age and an increasing likelihood that you might be having some form of disability, there will be lots of FTSE board members. But the fact that no one either felt it was appropriate or necessary to talk about that. And I got a bit of stick for saying on social media that I thought that leaders had a responsibility to lead from the front on these issues. And lots of people said, but this is a very personal matter and people shouldn't feel that they're going to be outed or anything. And of course they shouldn't. The point I was trying to make, maybe not as skillfully as I could have done, is that if you are in a leadership position, which obviously a FTSE board member, for instance, is, and you are disabled, wouldn't it be wonderful if you felt sufficiently confident that you could talk about it to encourage young people at the beginnings of their careers so that they feel inspired because my goodness, if so-and-so can be on the board of this company, then I certainly can apply and can get into this organization and can advance in this organization. So I do think a starting point is being able to have more of the conversations. I mean, if you look at the way in which debates in this country about mental health were transformed when the then CEO of Lloyds Bank, Antonio, was open and prepared to talk about his own situation. Now, you could say he didn't have much choice, because the fact that your CEO is taking a leave of absence for 2 or 3 months with stress and so on is a significant development that has to be notified to the markets and so on. So they couldn't just ignore it. But the fact that he felt in time confident enough to talk about his own position, I think was not just the only factor. Things like the work that Dennis Stevenson and Paul Farmer did on their review for the government on mental health in the workplace, and how it would, if you improve mental health in the workplace, you would have a huge beneficial impact on productivity and on the performance of business and so on, and the economy generally, all contributed. The young princes and their leadership role on mental health contributed too. But I think having some leaders talking about their own mental health issues helped, which is why I'm very keen that we get more disabled leaders talking about their position. We have a disability employment gap in this country of almost 30 percentage points, 28.8% in Q4 of 2021. I think that is absolutely scandalous. And I think that when we are thinking about our CMI 75th working group, some of the things that we want to push forward, there is no doubt that one of the challenges is how do we get many more disabled people of working age into employment and to stay successfully in employment and to help them to advance in the workplaces. Yes, there are some people who, because of the nature of their disabilities, will never be able to work. But I do not believe that that represents almost 30 percentage points more than people who do not have a disability of the same age. And we know that's not the case in some other EU countries, notably in countries like Luxembourg or France, where the disability employment gap is markedly smaller. So that's our big macro challenge as a society. And of course, it requires action by lots of different people. But for me, one of the starting points is making sure that education gives every disabled child the very best possible opportunity, that careers services are really geared up to help young disabled students to be aspirational rather than to absolutely suppress and diminish people's ambitions. I've often heard David Blunkett, the former cabinet minister, talking about the fact that when he was a teenager, his careers advisor said, well, maybe you could one day hope to become a secretary. He said, no one ever suggested I might become Secretary of State for Education. And I think we know the importance of good teachers, inspiring people to feel that they have possibilities. So that's the starting point. But then once you have talent in the pipeline, you need to make sure that that talent is being nurtured all the way through. So one of the things we have in Cheshire, for example, is a program to help disabled students, typically in their third year of their undergraduate studies, to have a paid summer internship so that they can get work experience, they can get extra things on their CV, and so that also the organizations that are receiving them can see, actually, we can employ disabled people. The work is not going to fall in. It's not that difficult to do. And then there's lots more that we can talk about in terms of the ways in which, once you've got people into work, how we need to help them in work.
And for those managers on the call that maybe want to help disabled people advance, what advice would you give them, and how would you encourage them to overcome what might be just their natural discomfort in confronting this more openly?
So I do think that that's a really important point, that there are lots and lots of people out there who want to do the right thing, but maybe are just sometimes a little bit awkward about, so how do you express this? How do you check whether somebody needs help to do something? Because I think there are a lot of false stereotypes about, oh well, disabled people won't be able to work as many hours, or they will be off sick all the time, etc., etc., which the evidence does not support. But where I think you need to give people encouragement to ask questions and to have honest, open conversations. And in turn, that's an obligation on those of us who are disabled, not to jump down somebody's throat the moment that they hear somebody saying something that's not quite the right phraseology. You just wait for the right kind of quiet moment and say, actually, we don't use that language about saying, for example, somebody is, say, wheelchair bound. Actually, they're simply a wheelchair user. They are somebody who is enabled, actually, by a wheelchair. They're not constrained by it. They're actually, it's an aid that helps people have more independence, more freedom. So, but not to jump down people's throats when they make an innocent mistake. So I'm actually now of an age, and I suppose my mobility is deteriorating a bit inevitably, and I use a walking stick most of the time. And so now people actually offer me their seat on the tube or on a London bus or something, or do I need some help to get off the bus or what have you? And I always sort of kind of smile, and even if I'm not taking them up on the offer, I always smile and say, that's so kind of you to ask. Thank you. No, I'm fine. Thank you. But thank you for asking, because it's so important that they feel encouraged. So when they have that idea the next time, they will want to do it and not feel discouraged. And it's just the same in the workplace in terms of managers feeling encouraged. And there are programs out there. We're in the process of designing some e-learning ourselves in Cheshire, which will be available soon, around just a kind of e-learning tool around some of the basics and things. But you have great organizations like the Business Disability Forum, which started life in the 1980s as Employers Forum for Disability, and has been doing great work now for over 30 years in terms of helping to share good practice amongst organizations around working with disabled employees. I am a huge fan of a brilliant new international initiative called the Valuable 500, which a brilliant social entrepreneur, Caroline Casey, has created and is running. And she's gone around the world getting 500 big companies to contribute and commit to make disability a boardroom agenda. She's now got a number of leading global companies like Apple championing different aspects of that boardroom agenda, like in the case of Apple, accessible technologies. Because one of the great things, we're having this conversation today virtually, and actually you and I have only met face to face once in the last year, even though we've been on a working party together and so on, because we've got all of these advances in technology. Many of these advances in technology are creating all kinds of new opportunities for disabled people. And so the potential of reducing the disability employment gap very substantially by clever uses of all kinds of technologies, by thinking about how does the move to more flexible working, more hybrid working, make it much easier for disabled people who maybe don't feel able to sort of navigate middle of London during rush hours and things, but who perfectly able to work from home and then maybe come in to the office once or twice a week or once or twice a fortnight out of the main commuting times. So I'm excited about the opportunities from technology, and I do think that there's a kind of obligation on all of us who are championing disability rights to be highlighting the opportunities of adaptive technologies.
Yeah, it's a great point. And obviously, hybrid working does open up opportunities, as you very rightly say, for disabled people that might not be able to commute every day, but are still perfectly capable of working effectively from home. And that you're right to cite the Value 500. It's a great initiative, and Caroline herself is blind, of course, and so there she is leading the charge of being somebody owning their disability and using it to get others more comfortable and committed. And obviously, the other resources you mentioned will be sure to be including in our 75th toolkit, because no doubt you'll be sharing those with us. But you mentioned technology. So what about other forms of discrimination, whether that's gender, ethnicity, age, class, as well as disability? Are there other ways that you think that technology and data might help us on our journey to make management and leadership, and indeed the world and business more inclusive?
Undoubtedly, and one of the practical things, as we are seeing in more parts of the world, more pressures on organizations to identify and to report, for example, on their gender pay gap or on their race pay gap, and I hope in the future also on their disability pay gap as well. So the potential to be able to aggregate lots of data in sensitive ways, to be able to have a better picture of how well this organization is doing. And for me, it's a critical point that lots of these dimensions of diversity and equity and inclusion aren't about ticking boxes. Mm-hmm. They are very much about understanding the huge amount of difference in all shapes and sizes that we have in the world. And that if organizations want to be relevant, if a significant teaching hospital wants to be relevant to its catchment area in all of its rich diversity and variety, or if a business or bank, say, wants to be able to understand where its different customer segments are coming from, you need to have diversity in your own workforce. Mm-hmm. But it's not just the diversity, it is then that people can, in the jargon, feel that they can be 100% human at work. They can bring their whole self to work. And so you get all of the advantages as an organization, and people don't feel that they have to hide really important parts of who they are.
Yeah, no, I think that's a hallmark of inclusivity, isn't it? Well, obviously, we've talked a lot about the impact of the last couple of years, and maybe you can share with us a couple of things. What have you personally learned from the pandemic about your leadership style? And maybe what do you think we've learned collectively as a society about the importance of management from the pandemic?
So I suppose for me, it's part of maybe a longer journey anyway, about being more mindful of where other people are at, mm-hmm. and being perhaps more patient to do that kind of checking in than perhaps when I was so mission focused and to be honest, a bit of a painful workaholic. I wasn't. So I think that for me is one of the important things about really being in the moment more. Mm-hmm. Number one. Although I emphasize again, that continues as a work in progress. Mm-hmm. And I think as a society, I hope we've learned at least two important things. One is about the key roles that are really fundamental to keeping a society operating. Mm-hmm. And yes, here in the UK, we went out on Thursday nights for ages, and we clapped the doctors and the nurses and the support staff in hospitals and the frontline care workers, and by extension, at least in my mind, as then chair of Carers UK, I was also clapping the millions of people who were unpaid caregivers looking after family members and so on. But we also, I think, recognized that we needed to have people from the different supermarkets doing the deliveries, risking their own health in order to keep us stocked with food and to enable people to shelter safely in their own homes and so on. So I hope subtly but crucially what society values in terms of the jobs that people do, that we're a bit more humble now about the range of important critical jobs in society, number one. And number two, I think back to the earlier conversation about the fact that lots of things can be done in very different ways, including remotely and so on, and people can work from home. And you don't need the kind of presentism of people being in offices from 9 to 5 or 8 to 6 or whatever it might be.
Excellent. I think those are both superb learnings, and obviously at CMI we endorse both of them. They're great examples. But you've also just released the Sustainable Business Handbook. I see it in the background over your shoulder.
Subtly placed there. Yeah.
Tell us, how do you think management and leadership needs to change or to be carried out in order for businesses to be more sustainable or become more sustainable? And are there any great examples in your mind of what to do or not to do?
So I have just done this new book with two co-authors, Chris Coulter, who's based in Toronto, and Mark Lee, who's based in the Bay Area in California. So our entire process of writing the book was done remotely. We didn't meet once. Everyone we interviewed were interviewing conversations like this, and so on, and all the relations we had with Kogan Page, the publisher, likewise. So it was an interesting experience in its own right. How do you replicate some of the great brainstorming sessions that Chris and Mark and I had in person for our previous book? Wasn't quite the same without the physical whiteboard and things, but we did our best. But we did try to distill what we thought were the really key elements that managers, leaders of any shape and size of organization, whether it's a small business or a big business, etc., what are the key things that they need to do in order to give themselves the best chance of embedding sustainability? So managing the social, environmental, and economic impacts, both reducing and minimizing ultimately the negative impacts, but also maximizing the positive impacts. And that's around things like understanding what are the most material impacts, because if you are a bank, it's very different to if you are a supermarket or if you are a mining company, etc. And then developing the sense with different stakeholders of what are the priorities for action, developing the comprehensive strategy around sustainability, and how does that align with and eventually become the same as in a company like Unilever now of a comprehensive overall strategy which incorporates absolutely the sustainability dimensions. And although we don't think it has to be the starting point, it is much easier to make really substantial progress if you have clarity about a broad societal purpose for your business. And I'm a great fan of what Colin Mayer and the purpose of the corporation project have been doing around. So what is the purpose of a business in the 2020s? And we've moved, I think, finally from the old Milton Friedman view that the only responsibility of business is to make profits within the law and the rules of the game. Important caveat, which lots of Friedmanites now forget. But I think we've moved away from that very simplistic notion, which unfortunately became the kind of the mantra in so many business schools around the world for far too long. We've moved to what people like Colin Mayer and purpose of the corporation are talking about, that the purpose of a business is to find profitable solutions to the problems of people and of planet, and not to profit from doing harm. Still emphasizes critically the importance of profits, but it's not having profits as the goal. It's the consequence of a well-run business, not the absolute driving purpose. So we're not dismantling capitalism. I think we're making a much more robust future, more sustainable, responsible capitalism. So in our book, we also talk about how do you go about defining your own organizational purpose. And then we look at things, as you won't be surprised to hear, like culture and leadership and the role of boards and how you get the most of different stakeholders. And certainly for businesses which are committed to sustainability, I have to avoid getting back into my last night's lecture at Cranfield, where it was all about businesses partnering and collaborating for sustainability. So I promise you, we won't go into Professor Oil mode, but the importance also of building really great partnerships.
Yeah.
And yes, we did find some new examples. So very deliberately, each chapter in the book has the same format of what we're talking about, why it matters and how to do it and so on. But then we developed for each of the 13 chapters two profiles. One of a company that you would expect to see in a book about good practice in sustainability. So the Unilevers and the Patagonias and the IKEAs and so on. But then in each case, we also deliberately went out and tried to find a company either that perhaps is from a part of the world that particularly readers in Europe and North America may be less familiar with, or it's a business that is relatively new to really taking sustainability seriously, or it's a relatively new company. So in addition to the usual suspects, if you like, when we talk about sustainable business, we've also got businesses like Suzano, which is a Brazilian company, fascinating. It's biggest paper pulp manufacturer in the world, and it came about through the merger of two existing businesses, and they really did some very thoughtful things around what's the kind of future culture we want in this new business. What's a sustainable culture look like? How do you make sure it's going to be an ethical culture and so on? So that was one of the examples. We talk about Primark, the fast fashion business, because they've just launched a really interesting, comprehensive new sustainability strategy around better cotton and things, but also, interestingly, around a commitment by 2030 to pay the living wage, not just in their own operations throughout the world, but also in their supply chain. And I think that is really, really important, really, really interesting. We're not saying that any of these businesses, by the way, that we profiled, getting absolutely everything right all the time, because they're all human organizations. And by definition, human organizations make mistakes, they fail sometimes and so on. But we deliberately tried to show a range of businesses from around the world. So companies like Discovery Bank in South Africa and Tata in India and so on.
That's great. And yeah, it's very interesting what you say about Primark. And actually, yesterday I was seeing an ad on TV about, actually advising consumers to buy less and wear it longer from a leading clothing manufacturer, right? So I think you're right. That's becoming much more important to us. And it sounds like a great book. So I'm sure I'll look forward to reading it, and many others will as well. We're going to have time for questions, but before we get to that, just a couple more questions for you, David, from me. Tell me about sponsorship. We talk about the importance of sponsorship. You said you can't be what you can't see. You encourage disabled leaders to admit their disability. What about sponsorship and its role in your career and in advancing some of the agendas, whether that's disability or indeed sustainable business that we've touched on today? How important is it?
So I guess by sponsorship, we're talking about coaching and mentoring and people
advocating for somebody.
Coaching. Yes. So, and I was reflecting that I have over the years had a number of absolutely awesome sponsors. I mean, I go back to when I was starting school again after my life-threatening and life-changing illness, osteomyelitis, that I had a brilliant teacher in the first year. I could hardly walk. And I was at a school that was rugby mad, sports mad on absolutely everything. And I was also the outsider because it was a Jesuit school, and I was the one. Well, actually, I think there was one other non-Catholic in the entire school, so I was also regarded as different because I wasn't of a particular faith, and on top of everything else, I couldn't do lots of the other things that most people or everyone in the school was expected to do, and so on, and where the hierarchy was, because the great sports people were the ones who were really encouraged. But this was a Jesuit school, and one of the great things about the Jesuits is that they looked to see and nurture the talent where it was. And so nobody was allowed to get too big for their boots, because somebody who was really good in the classroom was not always very good on the rugby field or the football field or the cricket pitch, etc. And I had a brilliant teacher in my first year who so nurtured me and helped me, supported me to learn to walk again and so on. But through my work career, I've had several people who were incredibly generous, patient mentors. So after my first couple of years in brand management, persuading me to buy a certain brand of washing up liquid, I decided that wasn't for me, and I was going to set up what we now call a social enterprise, although we didn't have that language in those days. And with a co-founder, we created something called Project Northeast in Newcastle, in the north of England, which is still going strong, I'm pleased to say, 42 years later. And one of our fantastic sponsors was a man called John McCarthy, happily still alive and doing well up in East Anglia. And John was one of the key leaders in Legal & General, the insurer. And they became a very early sponsor of this completely unknown entity, these two, whippersnappers, 24-year-olds who were coming up with some ideas that they were passionate about. And he sort of gradually nurtured us, helped us to be able, introduced us to lots of people, basically validated us. He had this wonderful line that, yes, we could use the Legal & General name to try and get support from some other companies, but we had to have some other companies in support, otherwise they wouldn't continue to support. He said, because, David, if I'm taking my chair and CEO over the cliff, I want other lemmings with me. Happily, we didn't take him over the cliff, I'm to say, but he was a great sponsor. Dennis Stevenson, very distinguished long-term entrepreneurial business leader. Dennis helped us out when we were first having the ideas for Project Northeast. He kept an eye on me and my co-founder David Irwin afterwards. And when I was starting at Cranfield and setting up a Centre for Corporate Responsibility and wanted to create an advisory council, Dennis was the person I turned to, and was a remarkable chair, even though he was going through lots of challenges at the time professionally and so on. But he was incredibly generous with his time and just sheer challenge.
Well, that's great. So there's some important messages in there for our listeners. One is get a sponsor when you're young, like you had with John, and because that can be, or indeed when you first return to school with your disability, that can be literally very life-changing for younger people to have that sponsorship. And then those people might continue to be sponsors, as it was the case with Dennis, right? So once a sponsor, always a sponsor. Maybe turn to them in later life. Two great lessons from those examples. Before we open it up for questions, because I can see some already in the chat, I just want to close with asking you a big question. What does a better, fairer society look like to you? And, well, what can others do? You're doing an awful lot to make this happen, as we've heard. But what advice for those who are listening would you give to them to help make it happen?
So I think, first of all, to take the smaller bit of the picture, because what does the better world will look like is that's a big one, probably above my pay grade. But first off, I think for individuals, almost all of us care about something. And I'm a great believer in life that identify your passions. Now, it's back to that wonderful Japanese idea that I wish I'd learnt about so much earlier in my career, the ikigai model of trying to identify what are you passionate about? What do you love doing? What are you good at? What does the world need? And crucially, what can you get paid to do? And if you can find something that hits the sweet spot of those four different elements, my goodness, you are going to have not necessarily an incredibly well-paid career, but I think you are going to have a better chance of a happier and more fulfilling life. So I think, first of all, in the context of contributing to broader society, what are you passionate about? What do you really care about? Some of my great friends are really passionate about helping homeless people. Some people are really passionate about making sure that animals are well looked after. Some people are really, really passionate about giving people who've had a criminal record a second chance, and so on. And there is so much need out there. There are so many challenges to meet. We aren't all the same, and we just need to identify and choose something that we think we can make a difference on, and actually go out and find allies to work with to do it.
Well, that's great advice. And those 4 points, just again, what are you passionate about? What are you good at? What does the world need? And what can you get paid to do? And maybe if we all did that, we would all build a better, fairer society. But again, questions coming in, but if you could just briefly, what's that better, fairer society look like to you?
So I think it is one where people do have both a sense of opportunity and a sense of possibility, where we are inclusive. Somebody said to me the other day, quoting a new book that's come out about the age of unpeace, I think it's called. And apparently the central thesis of this book is that we built a global world for tribal people. We built a global world for tribal people. And I think we have to, above all, get out of our sense of tribalism, and rather than seeing the difference, the other, see the commonality with our fellow human beings. That's the first thing. And I think critically, and Paul Polman, the ex-Unilever boss, summed this up so brilliantly the other day, that for him, sustainability is about the golden rule of all the world's great religions and philosophical traditions, but in an intergenerational context. In other words, we have to be thinking about the future and about future generations in the context of do unto others, not just do unto others now, but do unto others in terms of the future. So how do we meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs? Those, for me, there's obviously a lot more, but those for me will be two fundamental points.
Brilliant thoughts. And we've got a number of questions. So thank you, David, for sharing all of that wisdom with us. Our first question comes from Kabir. What are the main challenges that leaders face when trying to implement a significant change to the culture of their organization?
So without really sort of falling too much back into business school professorial speak, which is always a danger, I'm afraid, even though I'm not a traditional, or I don't think I'm a traditional academic by any means. But I do think clearly there is the resistance out of fear of the unknown, fear of doing things differently, etc. There is the sort of the vested interest sometimes in, well, you know, we're doing pretty well out of doing it this way. Why on earth would we want to change, etc.? And unless there is the burning platform, perhaps you haven't got the sense that there needs to be change. So I think, and this goes back to, we all have I know our own definitions of leadership and so on, but for me, so leadership goes back to being able to paint the picture of where the organization is today, realistically, you know, not just sugarcoating it. Secondly, painting the picture of where we want the organization to be in the future, which is exciting, is positive. But critically then, thirdly, here is a credible plan, may not be completely worked out. Churchill in 1940 definitely didn't know how he was going to beat Hitler ultimately. He just knew that was the plan, to get from blood, sweat, toil and tears today to a better tomorrow. But having at least the beginnings of a credible plan, but critically, and I think this is the bit that so often gets forgotten, is then a leader has to be able to explain, how do you contribute and how does your team contribute to getting from today to tomorrow? Or in some cases, being honest and upfront actually, we're going to have to go through a painful restructuring here. I'm afraid, sadly, there won't be space, but we'll do our best to help you to move on and so on. I think very often that fourth bit is I think that was Sky News telling us that there's something more exciting happening, Anne.
Sorry about that. That snuck in there, but never mind. That's great advice. Now, our next question is from Manpreet, who's asking, how do we overcome unconscious bias in organizations?
So I guess, first of all, Manpreet, by recognizing that there may well be some unconscious bias in the organization, and by getting people into conversations. I mean, it comes back to, is this an organization, is the culture of this organization one with high trust, or is it one where there are very, very low trust levels?
Yeah.
If it's low trust levels, it's going to be much, much harder to persuade people to talk about things which by definition are very often very difficult. And so I don't think, this is why so much of what the CMI works on, promotes so hard and so brilliantly, is so important, because it's not a series of silos. And it's critically important, if you want to really make genuine progress around diversity and equity and inclusion, that you've got trust levels high in order to be able to have these difficult conversations. That's where people being allies, for example, in relation to creating a safe environment where LGBT plus individuals feel that it is safe to be 100% human at work, and so on, again, becomes so important.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. So start with trust. What's the best career advice you received from a mentor? I think that's a question from Ruth.
Gosh, well, thank you, Ruth. And I guess the best career advice is about having that clarity about live the life that you want to lead, and not the life that you think other people are wanting you to lead.
Mm-hmm. That's a very important point, and maybe explains why after 2 years of selling dishwashing liquid, you went off and founded the Northeast Project, right?
Exactly. And various other turning points in my life as well. It took me a long time to understand that in all its different dimensions. And again, it's work in progress.
Great. So our last question for today comes from Leroy. It's a great question. So how can we incentivize mid-size and smaller companies to invest the time and effort, resources, and just thinking into becoming more sustainable?
It is a great question, Leroy. And I think the answer is because it's in their long-term best interest to do so, because it's what an increasing number of their big business customers are expecting of them, and indeed in many cases are now requiring of them, because these big business customers are making all kinds of ambitious goals and aspirational statements which they can only fulfill if their supply chain plays its part. So that I think is part of it. But I think lots of employees, not everyone, of course, you've still got some who have the mating call of the Porsche, as my good friend Julia Cleverden always refers to it. But I think you have lots more employees and would-be employees who want to feel, and Daniel Pink told us this brilliantly in Drive all those years ago in that brilliant book. What do we want at work? We want mastery. In other words, we want to be trained to be able to do a really good job. We want autonomy. Once we've been trained, we want to be left to get on and do the job. We don't want to be micromanaged. But above all, we need to feel that what we're doing is important, that there is a sense of purpose. So I think that it's in the interests of those medium-sized businesses, small businesses, to see this is not somehow something which is an extra cost to them. I always say I'm less interested in you worrying about this is going to cost us. I'm much more interested in how we find ways that this is going to save you money and make you money, and also it's going to help you to be more resilient with your big business customers, with your employees, and so on.
Great. By outlining the benefits, I suppose, right, and the inevitability of survival for those businesses themselves, it'll make them more sustainable if they're sustainable. David, thank you so much. That's been incredibly insightful and lots of very profound wisdom there. Thank you so much for joining us. I know people have gotten a lot out of that. And for those of you that have joined us this morning or this afternoon and have liked what you've heard, please consider signing up and joining CMI. You'll find out how to do so in the chat. Thank you all and have a great day.
Thank you very much for having me.